When power isn't just on paper, even the loudest voices at the gate can't stop it. The morning sun hit my ranch like a spotlight on chaos, its golden rays cutting through the crisp air and glinting off the dewy grass, illuminating the absurd scene with an almost cinematic clarity. Karen from the HOA had parked her oversized black SUV directly across my gate, the vehicle's engine humming softly as if it were part of her defiant stance, and she stood there with arms crossed, feet planted firmly, yelling about unauthorized access like the self-appointed guardian of laws she barely understood. The neighborhood, usually quiet at this hour, seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for the inevitable clash between entitlement and ownership. I approached slowly, deliberately, my boots crunching on the gravel driveway, my hand brushing against the worn leather of my pocket notebook, the one I used to catalog everything, knowing full well this confrontation had been simmering under the surface for weeks, months even, with every HOA email, every passive-aggressive notice, every uninvited inspection adding fuel to a fire that Karen didn't even know she was about to ignite. She didn't see me approach. She was too busy gesturing wildly, pointing at the metal gate like it was an extension of her authority, shrieking about rules she had invented in her own mind. I raised a hand in a half-wave, half-calming gesture, keeping my tone deceptively light and neutral, the kind of tone that hides a storm beneath a calm lake, because patience was my secret weapon, and I had more than enough of it to make her crumble under her own misplaced confidence. "Good morning, Karen," I said, my voice smooth but firm, as though greeting an old acquaintance rather than a lawbreaker, and she froze for a fraction of a second, perhaps surprised that I hadn't exploded in anger, that I hadn't yelled, that I hadn't done anything predictable. That fraction of hesitation was enough. She resumed her tirade, raising her voice even higher, as if volume alone could make her legitimate, calling the cops mid-argument, thinking she had the law on her side, her finger trembling slightly as she tapped her phone like a conductor commanding an invisible orchestra. I didn't flinch. I had anticipated this. I had anticipated the look of superiority in her eyes, the righteous indignation, the panic when she realized she couldn't actually enforce anything she claimed. While she spoke to the dispatch operator, my camera phone came out smoothly, discreetly, capturing every word, every gesture, every flare of anger and frustration, as if the device itself were a silent witness to her unraveling authority. I took notes in rapid shorthand, documenting the time, the date, the exact positioning of her SUV, the license plate number, her tone, her inflection, the absurdity of her claims. Every little detail mattered, because details were leverage, details were ammunition, and leverage was the currency in a game that Karen didn't even realize she was losing. Around us, the ranch seemed indifferent, the horses in their corral flicking their tails lazily, the chickens pecking at the dust without a care, the wind moving through the trees like a gentle sigh, all of it contrasting sharply with the human chaos concentrated at the gate. I smiled behind my mask of courtesy, a subtle, almost invisible curve of the lips, because I knew something she couldn't see. This wasn't merely a dispute over access, over trespassing, over petty HOA regulations. This was a chessboard, and she was playing checkers. Little did she know that the ranch wasn't just a piece of property with fences and gates. It was leverage, a tangible, undeniable power that came with legal weight, financial influence, and strategic advantage, a fact she could not begin to comprehend because she measured authority by loudness, by intimidation, by the ability to summon a uniformed officer to a scene, none of which mattered here, none of which could touch the truth etched in the deeds and records tucked away in my files. As she continued to yell, I maintained my composure, occasionally nodding, occasionally interjecting with neutral phrases like, "I understand your concern," knowing full well that acknowledgement alone could unsettle her more than any argument I could muster, because confidence wrapped in calm logic is an unnerving sight to someone accustomed to control through aggression. Cars began slowing down on the adjacent road, neighbors craning their necks to witness the spectacle, some curious, some concerned, some silently amused at the theatrics of HOA enforcement gone rogue. I noticed the subtle tension in the air, the quiet anticipation, the invisible audience weighing the balance of power, and I made a mental note. Witnesses were witnesses only if they observed the truth, and the truth was mine to reveal. Karen's call to the police dragged on, her words growing more frantic, more clipped, her face flushed with the exertion of authority she assumed she wielded. By the time a patrol car finally appeared, lights flashing but no sirens, I had everything recorded, documented, and logged with precision, each second of the encounter preserved like currency in a vault. The officer, a young man with the polite skepticism that comes from too many HOA complaints, listened to her, nodded, glanced at me, and then asked the single question that matters in moments like this. "Do you own this property?" I responded simply, calmly, with a slight lift of my chin. "Yes, all of it." His expression shifted subtly, the recognition of legal reality crossing his face faster than any argument Karen could muster. Karen sputtered, the SUV's engine still idling, her hands trembling, her authority evaporating with every tick of the clock. And in that moment, the world seemed to slow, the golden light of the morning casting long shadows across the gravel, across the gate, across the scene of what would later be recounted in hushed tones or whispered messages. The day the HOA thought they could impose control over something they did not own. I stayed calm, maintained my posture, kept filming, kept smiling behind my mask, knowing that this confrontation, this seemingly minor incident, was merely the first move in a much larger game. A game where patience, evidence, and leverage were the ultimate weapons, and Karen, for all her yelling, all her misplaced confidence, had unwittingly stepped into my arena, a place where authority is dictated not by noise, but by law, ownership, and preparation. A place where the morning sun illuminates the truth, and where chaos, however loud, ultimately bows to certainty. Once the cops had reluctantly departed, shaking their heads at what they clearly considered an absurd and petty confrontation, I walked back toward my office across the wide expanse of my ranch, feeling the crunch of gravel beneath my boots and the slight warmth of the morning sun on my shoulders, a sharp contrast to the tension that still lingered in the air near the gate, where Karen's SUV now sat abandoned and inert, a monument to misjudged authority. I closed the gate behind me, the metallic click echoing softly like a punctuation mark at the end of a chaotic paragraph, and entered my office, a space that had been curated with the same deliberate precision I applied to everything I touched, floor-to-ceiling shelves lined with legal tomes, financial records meticulously organized in binders and digital archives, several monitors displaying real-time updates on land deeds, tax filings, and various government allocations, and a single leather chair positioned perfectly at the center of the room where I could oversee every document with an unobstructed view. I sat down and exhaled slowly, allowing myself a momentary sense of satisfaction that came not from vindictiveness, but from the quiet knowledge that the scales of reality had begun to tip in my favor. My eyes immediately fell upon the folders that contained the federal funding documents I had acquired over the past year with surgical precision and strategic patience, materials so carefully obtained and documented that not even the most diligent HOA administrator could have stumbled upon them without exhaustive research. These were grants, allocations, and agreements that flowed through local channels yet originated at the federal level, money that funded community projects, landscaping contracts, neighborhood patrols, recreational facilities, administrative salaries, and a host of other operational expenses that the HOA depended upon for its very existence. As I flipped through the documents, scanning each page with a practiced eye, I felt the elegance of the leverage I now wielded, the subtle, quiet force of someone who understood systems, bureaucracy, and human nature, and who could manipulate the invisible levers of authority without ever raising a hand in anger or threat. Each grant application, each approval letter, each time-stamped digital confirmation was a thread in a web of influence I had carefully woven over months, a web that now stretched directly beneath the unsuspecting feet of those who believed themselves untouchable. Karen had no idea that while she paraded around her gate with the self-assurance of a ruler, she had been unknowingly standing atop a network I controlled, a network so intricately tied to their operations that a single, well-placed decision from me could halt projects, freeze funding, and bring the HOA's bureaucratic machinery to a grinding halt. I leaned back in my chair, fingers steepled, eyes narrowing slightly as I considered the sheer power of this reality. The HOA thrived because of external support, and I had become the invisible architect of that support, the silent hand that dictated the flow of resources upon which their authority depended. This was not about revenge, I reminded myself. It was about restoring reality, about aligning perceived authority with actual control, about ensuring that entitlement did not masquerade as power unchecked. I began running simulations in my mind, envisioning every possible reaction from the HOA, from Karen herself to the board members who had sat in meeting rooms, rubber-stamping decisions with the assumption that their influence was absolute. I could see them panicking as projects stalled, as communications were delayed, as financial flows were questioned, an elegant domino effect, each piece falling precisely because of the leverage they had never known existed, a leverage quietly cultivated and now poised to reshape their understanding of who truly held the reins. The subtlety of this power was intoxicating because it was invisible to the untrained eye, a force that could topple structures of assumed control without confrontation, without spectacle, without violence, relying purely on foresight, patience, and strategic positioning. I reviewed the numbers again, tracing each line item, each allocation, connecting the dots between the funding sources and the HOA's operational dependencies, realizing that almost every aspect of their functioning was tied, in one way or another, to resources I now controlled. The realization was almost lyrical in its simplicity. They had authority only because someone else enabled it, and that someone else had been me all along, quietly orchestrating a scenario where the illusion of power could be maintained until the moment of revelation, a moment I could now time perfectly, a moment that would teach lessons far more enduring than any confrontation at a gate. I drafted notes, outlining scenarios where funding could be delayed, redirected, or paused entirely, each note precise, methodical, and calculated with an almost clinical detachment. This was not about malice, it was about equilibrium, about correcting a misunderstanding that had persisted for too long. I could see Karen's face, flushed with indignation and disbelief, as she finally realized that the petty authority she had wielded like a weapon was meaningless in the face of the legal, financial, and bureaucratic truth. The more I reviewed the documents, the more I appreciated the artistry of subtle power, the way it could be built quietly, layer upon layer, until a single action could ripple across a network in ways that spectacle and shouting could never achieve. I sipped my coffee, its warmth grounding me in the moment, and allowed myself the faintest smile, knowing that patience had brought me here, and that leverage, when understood and properly deployed, was the ultimate equalizer. This was the turning point, the moment where invisible power crystallized into undeniable reality, where knowledge became influence, where control did not need to be asserted through confrontation because the infrastructure of dependency had been laid bare. I began drafting emails, notes, and contingency plans, outlining ways to communicate with contractors, vendors, and federal contacts, ensuring that every thread of influence was accounted for, every potential loophole considered. It was a dance of precision, strategy, and foresight, one that would render the HOA's assumed omnipotence irrelevant without them even realizing it until the effects cascaded around them. As I worked, I felt a quiet satisfaction that had nothing to do with revenge, everything to do with clarity. This was about reality, about showing that authority without substance is hollow, that entitlement without accountability is fragile, and that sometimes the most devastating power is not shouted from gates or meeting rooms, but held quietly in documents, approvals, and strategic patience. Hours passed unnoticed, the sun shifting in the sky, casting long shadows across the office floor, highlighting the neat rows of files, the blinking monitors, the meticulous maps of land and allocations spread before me. I knew the day would come soon when Karen and the HOA would finally understand the scale of what they had underestimated, when their assumptions would be confronted by the undeniable facts of ownership, influence, and control. Until then, I continued to plan, to document, to refine my approach, confident that leverage, once fully realized, was not only elegant but unstoppable, a quiet power that reshapes reality itself, turning absurd confrontations at gates into lessons about true authority and the consequences of ignorance. And as the afternoon light filled the office, warm and unwavering, I felt the satisfaction of a strategist who had won not by aggression, but by foresight, not by spectacle, but by preparation, knowing that the HOA's world, built on assumptions, bureaucracy, and misplaced confidence, was about to intersect with the undeniable truth, that the real power had always been in my hands, quietly, subtly, devastatingly effective. By noon, the sun had climbed high enough to scorch the gravel paths of my ranch, casting sharp, precise shadows that mirrored the tension about to unfold. And there she was, Karen, packing in frantic circles outside the HOA office, her oversized SUV parked haphazardly in the lot, tires crunching over loose stones as if reflecting her internal chaos, a Bluetooth headset clamped tightly to her ear, her face flushed with a mix of indignation, disbelief, and rising panic. And I watched from my porch, leaning against the railing with a cup of coffee in my hands, the steam curling lazily upward, utterly calm, a spectator to the unraveling of a persona that had previously exuded unshakable authority, her voice shrill, sharp, and increasingly desperate, carrying across the quiet suburban streets as she shouted into the earpiece, "You can't do this. You have no right. This is impossible." Unaware that the you on the other end was not some abstract power, but the very reality of the funding streams she had always taken for granted. The grants, approvals, and allocations that kept her office running, her staff paid, her projects moving, all now controlled with a quiet, deliberate precision by someone she had assumed was just another neighbor, another property owner, another face in a sea of entitled residents. And with every sentence she barked, every frantic gesture, every sharp intake of breath, I could see the smug confidence she had carried like armor over the past weeks begin to crumble. The armor dented, cracked, and slowly falling away under the invisible pressure of leverage she had never noticed, never understood, and could not combat, because this was not about confrontation, this was about the truth of control, the undeniable power of ownership combined with legal and financial authority, a combination that could bring even the loudest, most confident HOA administrator to her knees without a single raised hand, without a single shouted order, without even the presence of the law she so eagerly called upon. And as I sipped my coffee, tasting the bitter warmth, I watched the transformation unfold in real time, her frantic packing replaced by small, sharp gestures of despair, her voice raising and breaking as she struggled to comprehend why the projects she had always relied upon were now halted, stalled, frozen mid-approval. And her fingers clenched and unclenched, trembling slightly as she scanned her office, realized the computers were pinging with delays, notices from contractors left unanswered, funds redirected, approvals paused, all under my name, my signature, my carefully documented authority. Every grant that had once flowed seamlessly through the channels she controlled now tethered to my will. A subtle yet devastating web of influence that left her powerless to act, powerless to recover. Powerless to reclaim even a fraction of the control she believed was inherent to her position. And the irony was exquisite, almost theatrical, as she shouted into the Bluetooth headset, begging, pleading, demanding explanations, none of which she would ever receive, because the truth was in the paperwork, in the approvals, in the quiet, calculated infrastructure I had built, while she focused on appearances, on petty confrontations, on maintaining a facade of power that could not withstand scrutiny or reality, and each passing minute heightened the dramatic tension, the very air around the HOA office vibrating with the silent panic of someone discovering that their empire was built on fragile assumptions, on the belief that shouting louder could bend reality to their will, when in fact, reality was immutable, documented, legal, and entirely out of reach. And as I stood there, observing, recording mental notes, appreciating the poetic justice of it all, I realized that the scene was not only a lesson in leverage, but a study in human psychology, in the collapse of entitlement under pressure, in the way smugness gives way to fear when confronted by competence, preparation, and the invisible yet undeniable weight of authority that cannot be fabricated or usurped. And inside her office, I imagined the board members reading emails, seeing halted transactions, frozen accounts, funding notices that required signatures now exclusively under my name, and I could almost hear the muffled gasps, the quiet murmurs of panic, the frantic attempts to phone contacts who were now powerless to override my control. And outside, Karen's packing slowed, her hands pulling at her hair, the Bluetooth slipping from one ear, her body language betraying the exact opposite of command, the transformation complete. From confident, self-important enforcer to someone grappling with a reality she could neither manipulate nor escape. and as I took another sip of coffee, the wind catching my hair and carrying the faint scent of the grass, the leather of my boots creaking slightly as I shifted weight, I allowed myself a small, almost imperceptible smile, knowing that the HOA's perception of control was now irrevocably fractured, that panic had replaced certainty, that the office which had once seemed invincible now trembled. Not metaphorically, but financially, administratively, and operationally, every grant approval, every allocation, every flow of resources now bearing my signature, my influence, my subtle yet devastating mark, and Karen's voice, now lower, frantic, begging, negotiating, failing in every attempt to regain ground, echoed across the quiet streets, a testament to the power of patience, foresight, and understanding the true levers of authority, a lesson delivered without violence, without confrontation. Without spectacle, only through meticulous preparation, careful observation, and the unwavering deployment of strategic leverage. And as the sun moved higher, illuminating the windows of the HOA office with harsh clarity, I leaned back against the porch railing, coffee cup in hand, and watched the unfolding scene like a maestro observing a symphony, every note of panic, every gesture of helplessness, every spike of desperation perfectly orchestrated by forces she could not see, could not anticipate, and could not influence. And I knew, with the calm certainty of someone who had played the long game, that this was only the beginning, that Karen would now understand in visceral, undeniable terms that authority without substance, entitlement without leverage, confidence without control, is nothing more than illusion. And as the shadows lengthened across my porch and the distant hum of stalled operations filled the air in my imagination, I realized that patience, documentation, and quiet dominance had done what confrontation never could, reduced arrogance to panic, disrupted a system built on assumptions, and demonstrated with elegant subtlety that true power is invisible, pervasive, and utterly transformative. And in that moment, I raised my coffee in a silent toast to the art of leverage, to the collapse of ignorance, and to the extraordinary satisfaction of watching reality finally align with truth. Instead of storming the HOA office or confronting Karen again, I chose a path that required patience, precision, and the subtle power of documentation, sitting at my desk in the quiet of my office, surrounded by organized files, glowing monitors, and the soft hum of computers tracking federal funding, grant approvals, and property records. I composed a single, concise, impeccably professional email addressed to the entire HOA board, the subject line neutral but commanding, stating simply that it contained critical information regarding ownership, control, and compliance. And as my fingers moved deliberately across the keyboard, I outlined in clear, unemotional language exactly what I owned, what legal and financial authority I controlled, and what the inevitable consequences would be if they persisted in obstructionist behavior, detailing specific grants, approvals, and operational dependencies without a hint of threat, but with unmistakable clarity. The kind of language that left no room for misinterpretation, the type of communication that carried the weight of law, finance, and strategic leverage all at once. And when I hit send, the email left no theatrics behind, no raised voices, no confrontation, only the cold, unyielding assertion of fact, a fact that would reverberate far more powerfully than any shouted argument. And then I waited, observing the ranch from my porch as the sun slanted across the property, illuminating the gates I now knew were truly mine to control, watching horses graze lazily, chickens clucking softly, the wind brushing through trees as if nature itself acknowledged the quiet shift in authority, and within hours the results became apparent, a silence more deafening than any confrontation, as my email circulated through the board members, bouncing off inboxes, generating confusion, concern, and silent calculation. Responses that might have been defiant or angry never arrived. Meetings previously scheduled with purpose and authority were postponed indefinitely, unanswered phone calls piled up in voicemail boxes, and the very air of the HOA's administrative operations seemed to pause, waiting for some acknowledgement or response that would never come. While the gates to the community remained open, security personnel hesitated in their movements, maintenance crews stopped mid-task, unsure whether they were permitted to proceed, and the bylaws that had once seemed to govern behavior, to impose rules, to create structure, suddenly felt irrelevant, powerless against the weight of documented authority, legal clarity, and financial control that I now wielded quietly but completely. And the more I observed, the more I appreciated the artistry of dominance without spectacle, The elegance of patience, preparation, and leverage combined into a single act that required no physical presence, no raised voice, no visible threat. Only the assertion of undeniable fact through precise documentation, a demonstration of power that was both invisible and absolute, because when people are confronted not with anger but with truth, with concrete evidence, with consequences that cannot be ignored, they cannot react with noise. They can only pause, reconsider, and ultimately comply or crumble quietly. And in this case, the compliance, or the helplessness, manifested as silence, as inactivity. As an abrupt cessation of all attempts to enforce authority, leaving the gates open, the streets unmonitored, the maintenance crews idle, emails unanswered, and meetings indefinitely postponed. A perfect orchestration of quiet domination that left no fingerprints, no chaos, no spectacle, only the slow, inexorable realization that the board's power was superficial, dependent entirely on the very resources and approvals now under my control. And the psychological impact of this invisible dominance began to ripple outward, unseen by the casual observer but palpable to those who had previously believed themselves untouchable, their every action now measured, cautious, hesitant, unsure whether the next step would trigger consequences they could not mitigate, while I from my perch on the porch observed the subtle shifts in the neighborhood, neighbors adjusting their schedules, contractors pausing deliveries. Emails from vendors and service providers reflecting delays or inquiries redirected to my office, the domino effect of leverage quietly cascading through every facet of community operations. And as I sipped my coffee, warm and steady, I felt the intoxicating satisfaction of a power that did not need to be flaunted, a power so deeply embedded in law, finance, and documentation that even the most aggressive attempts to challenge it would falter under the weight of clarity and preparation. And I realized that true domination is not measured by chaos created, but by control exerted invisibly, the kind that makes rules irrelevant, gates open, and opposition impotent, that demonstrates without spectacle that authority built on assumption, entitlement, and arrogance collapses instantly when confronted by patience, evidence, and strategic foresight. And as the day wore on, emails from the board remained unreturned, voicemails unanswered, meetings cancelled, while every contractor, service provider, and administrative contact now understood, quietly, subtly, without confrontation, that the power to authorize, approve, and enforce was no longer theirs, that their actions would proceed only with consent I controlled, and that any attempt to circumvent this new reality would meet not hostility, but the immovable force of preparation, legality, and strategic leverage. And as the shadows lengthened across my ranch, falling over the gates, the gravel paths, the idle crews, and the silent offices, I leaned back, the weight of quiet domination settling comfortably upon me, appreciating the elegance, the subtlety, and the devastating effectiveness of a victory achieved not through confrontation, but through patience, foresight, and the unassailable assertion of truth. A victory so complete that it needed no fanfare, no noise, no spectacle, only the slow, steady collapse of an outdated hierarchy and the invisible, pervasive assertion of authority that finally aligned perception with reality. And in that stillness, with the ranch calm around me and the neighborhood adjusting unconsciously to the invisible shift, I understood fully that domination is most powerful when quiet, elegant, and undeniable, a force so subtle that those who previously wielded authority could neither resist it nor comprehend its depth, until it had already reshaped the entire system of control, leaving them and the world around them to adapt or fade into irrelevance under the weight of invisible, methodical, and utterly effective influence. Karen finally showed up again, striding onto my property with that familiar mix of indignation and feigned authority, her oversized heels clicking sharply against the gravel driveway, her face set in what she clearly intended to be a look of command. But I had learned by now that confidence without substance is paper-thin, and I watched her approach calmly from the porch, coffee in hand, as the morning sun glinted off the edges of my office windows and the gates behind her remained perfectly still, open. And unquestioned, a silent testament to control that required no yelling, no signage, no security presence, only the quiet assertion of undeniable truth. And as she raised her voice, beginning her familiar lecture about bylaws, access, and responsibilities that supposedly bound me, I set my cup down, allowed a slow, measured smile to spread across my face, and reached for the folder I had placed conspicuously on the desk earlier, the one containing every document, every approval, every grant, every allocation, every piece of bureaucratic evidence that demonstrated with irrefutable clarity exactly who held the real power. And I said simply, deliberately, "Funny story," my tone light, casual, almost conversational, as if I were remarking on the weather rather than confronting someone who had spent weeks trying to intimidate me. "I control the very funds that keep your HOA running," holding up the folder so the sunlight glinted off the edges of the paper. Leather cover, the embossed official stamps, a visual exclamation point to accompany the verbal declaration. And in that moment I saw the shift, the subtle, almost imperceptible change in her posture, the way her shoulders dropped slightly as if the air had been knocked out of her, the moment when understanding crashes through ego like a thunderclap, the exact point at which someone realizes that everything they believed about power, authority, and control is not only incomplete, but fundamentally inverted. And her face turned pale, the color draining as panic, disbelief, and the dawning comprehension of her impotence overtook the smug confidence she had carried for so long, her mouth opening and closing as though to protest, to argue, to reclaim some semblance of authority, but words failed her because this was not about opinion, this was not about debate, this was about fact, about leverage, about a quiet but undeniable force she had never even noticed, let alone understood. And as she struggled to grasp the reality, I leaned back slightly, fingers steepled, observing the tableau with detached satisfaction, knowing that her previous attempts at intimidation, shouting, and calling law enforcement had been rendered irrelevant by the patient construction of influence that required no theatrics, only foresight, preparation, and the slow accumulation of power that is invisible to those too focused on appearances. And I could see her mind racing, connecting the dots too late. Realizing that every project she had approved, every budget she had signed off on, every administrative decision she had believed was hers to enforce, had been contingent on channels I controlled, funds that flowed only at my discretion, approvals that required my authorization, and that her authority, her confidence, her assumptions of command were illusions, fragile constructs that collapsed instantly in the face of true leverage and in the silence that followed my statement. I allowed her a moment to process, to feel the weight of reality pressing down on her, a moment in which every person who had ever questioned my ownership, my presence, or my decisions could see without words that authority has limits, and that influence, when properly understood and wielded, defines the boundaries of what can and cannot be enforced. And the HOA board, which had previously operated with the confidence of entitlement, the assumption that rules and bylaws could coerce compliance, would now be forced to reckon with the undeniable truth that their operations, their funding, their very existence as a governing body was contingent upon consent they could no longer assume. And I could sense the ripple of comprehension radiating outward from Karen, the subtle shift in her expression, the hesitation in her stance, the involuntary step back, as if instinctively acknowledging that confrontation was no longer viable, and as the seconds stretched into minutes. The impact of my quiet declaration settled like a heavy curtain over the room, over the property, over the entire concept of what control truly means, and I continued, calm and measured, my voice soft but firm, emphasizing the point without aggression, outlining that this was not personal, that there was no vendetta, that there was only the alignment of authority with reality, the enforcement of consequence through the infrastructure of leverage, rather than the theatrics of intimidation. And with each word, I could see Karen shrinking into herself, the realization fully formed. She had been attempting to assert power over someone who not only owned the land, but controlled the very mechanisms that enabled her office to function, a duality of ownership and influence that left her powerless to act, powerless to protest, and powerless to intimidate. And as she turned, shoulders slumping, the fight draining from her stance, the fire in her eyes dimming, I understood that the lesson had been delivered with precision, elegance, and efficiency. That confrontation had been unnecessary because the true demonstration of power does not shout, does not posture, does not rely on force, but exists quietly, invisibly in the systems that govern reality, in the approvals, signatures, and controls that dictate the flow of resources and authority. And from that day forward, the HOA learned that authority ends where leverage begins, that rules without enforcement, bylaws without consent, and confidence without control are meaningless. And that the quiet accumulation of influence, the patient construction of power, the careful documentation and strategic positioning of authority can achieve what shouting, threats, and spectacle never could. And as I walked back to the porch, coffee in hand, watching Karen retreat toward her office, the air heavy with the unspoken acknowledgement of defeat. I felt the satisfaction of a strategist whose patience, preparation, and foresight had rewritten the dynamics of control. Reshaping the HOA's perception of power forever, and the gates remained open, the maintenance crews resumed work. The neighborhood continued as usual, but beneath the surface, the understanding had shifted. Leverage defines authority, ownership magnifies it, and those who fail to recognize both find themselves humbled quietly but irreversibly, a lesson learned not through confrontation, but through elegant, devastating precision. The ranch ran smoothly now, the kind of seamless operation that comes from quiet control, where every gate, fence, and pathway functioned exactly as intended, where horses moved freely in their pastures, maintenance crews worked on precise schedules without the interference of misinformed directives, and the entire property reflected the order that only patience, preparation, and strategic authority could create, while the HOA, once a constant thorn in my side, no longer dared interfere in any meaningful way, their emails unanswered, their phone calls routed through bureaucratic channels that led nowhere, their scheduled meetings postponed indefinitely, and Karen, the face of their previous arrogance, had finally moved on, muttering under her breath about frustrations she could not articulate, her confidence replaced by the quiet acknowledgement of her impotence, a lesson delivered with elegance and without confrontation. And as I walked along the gravel driveway, boots crunching softly, the early morning sun casting long, golden shadows across the ranch, I reflected on the subtlety of the power that now governed the situation, the invisible but undeniable influence that had reshaped the dynamics of authority, and I understood more clearly than ever that true power often works in silence, hidden in plain sight, in the meticulous management of legal documents, the patient accumulation of leverage, and the calm execution of control that requires no spectacle, no threats, no dramatics, only the quiet knowledge of who really holds the keys, the ability to make decisions ripple outward through systems that others take for granted, and the satisfaction that comes not from public acknowledgement, but from the unshakable certainty that the foundation of authority is grounded in substance, not noise. And as I moved through the ranch, checking the fences, observing the workers, reviewing schedules and logs, I felt a serene confidence, knowing that the gates remained open on my terms, that maintenance proceeded according to careful planning, that the smooth operation of every detail reflected the strategic mastery I had quietly established, and in the absence of confrontation, the HOA had no role, no influence, no leverage to impose, their bylaws and regulations rendered effectively irrelevant, the illusion of their authority dissolved quietly like morning mist under the sun. And the lesson was not just for Karen or the board, but for the neighborhood itself, the subtle but visible shift in control altering perceptions, setting a precedent, demonstrating that ownership and influence matter more than aggression, loudness, or assumed power, and as the day progressed, contractors arrived on schedule, service providers followed precise instructions, deliveries were timed perfectly, and every administrative task unfolded with the efficiency of a system managed by someone who understood the intricate balance of leverage, law, and patience. While I observed from the porch, coffee in hand, the horizon stretching wide, the ranch alive with motion yet perfectly contained, and I allowed myself the quiet satisfaction of knowing that control does not require constant assertion, that authority reinforced by preparation and insight is far more effective than any temporary show of force. And the psychological impact of this new order was profound. For those who had previously attempted to assert control over the property or its operations now approached cautiously, aware that the quiet mastery I held could not be challenged without consequence, that the real power was invisible, pervasive, and absolute. And as I moved to review my documentation, checking the federal funding, grant approvals, and operational records that supported every aspect of the HOA's now limited function, I felt the elegant certainty of dominance achieved without confrontation, a demonstration that paperwork, patience, and strategic foresight can enforce authority far more effectively than noise or aggression. And as the sun began to set, casting warm amber light across the sprawling fields, illuminating every fence post, pasture, and building with a serene glow, I walked slowly along the paths I had meticulously organized, noting the harmony of operations, the absence of disruption, and the subtle respect, whether conscious or unconscious, from those who had witnessed or been affected by the shift in power, and it became clear that the lessons had sunk in. Authority is fragile when divorced from leverage, enforcement is meaningless without the power to sustain it, and confidence without comprehension of the underlying systems is inherently vulnerable. And as I returned to my office, reviewing logs, approving schedules, and ensuring every operation continued smoothly, I understood that this quiet order, this carefully orchestrated balance, was far more satisfying than any public victory, because it represented mastery without spectacle. Control without chaos, dominance without confrontation, and in the stillness of the evening, with the ranch bathed in the soft glow of twilight, the gates open yet perfectly secure, the animals calm, the crews efficient, and the HOA silent, I felt the profound satisfaction that comes only from knowing that true authority lies not in loud declarations, not in visible shows of power, but in the unshakable knowledge of who truly holds the keys, in the patient, elegant, and devastatingly effective execution of leverage, preparation, and insight. And in that moment, I returned to my quiet life, fully aware that sometimes the most effective weapon is not anger, not threats, not spectacle, but paperwork, patience, and the serene confidence of knowing, without doubt, that control has been established, maintained, and will endure, that the ranch operates not through intimidation, but through invisible mastery, and that the HOA, along with anyone else who had underestimated the subtlety of true power, now existed in a reality they could neither alter nor influence. And as night fell across the property, the stars emerging above the quiet fields, the ranch remained a testament to the elegance of quiet domination, a living proof that patience, preparation, and the strategic assertion of authority create a new order where rules, bylaws, and assumed power fall silently into irrelevance, leaving only the calm, steady presence of someone who knows exactly who holds the keys, and whose influence, though invisible, defines the reality of every operation, every decision, and every boundary within this domain.